Welcome to part 2 of lecture 13. This is going to be the second part of our endocrine system lectures. Today we're going to talk about hormone control, and we're also going to talk about some specific hormones of the pituitary gland. This material is from chapter 16 in Marib. Let's first begin talking in some general terms about control of hormone secretion. You should be aware that there are three major mechanisms that control hormonal secretion, as you see here. There's neural control, that is controlled by nerves. Humoral control, that is controlled by something that's in the plasma of the blood. And finally, hormonal control. This is hormone release controlled by another hormone. Let's take a look at each of these in turn. First, we'll look at neural control. A good example of this, as we'll see a little bit later on, is the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla. This is actually caused by a sympathetic neuron that comes from the brain, goes all the way down to the adrenal medulla, and causes the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So that's a good example of neural control. And what you can see here is that there's a nerve that releases some type of neurotransmitter that actually causes the release of a hormone. So the endocrine organ releases a hormone in response to some type of neurotransmitter. And this is why we call this neural control of hormone release. Now typically what will happen is the hormone levels will rise, whatever the hormone is, and will usually shut down the release of the neurotransmitter by those nerves. So this is an example of negative feedback. In the second type of hormone control, humoral control, we're talking about something that's in the blood plasma. And the example that I have illustrated here is the level of calcium ions. When calcium ions, for example, get too high in the blood, these high levels of calcium stimulate the thyroid gland to release a hormone called calcitonin, and that will actually lower calcium levels. On the other hand, when calcium levels get too low in the blood, the parathyroid glands are stimulated to secrete parathyroid hormone, and that will cause calcium levels to go up in the blood. So once again, this is an example of negative feedback control as well, but this release of the hormone is controlled by something that's in the blood plasma. And also note that something that's in the plasma is not a hormone, it's a different kind of substance. Even though it's traveling in the blood, we're talking about something here, for example, that's just ions. We might also use an example of glucose. Glucose is something that can cause release of insulin and glucagon from the pancreas. But glucose itself is not a hormone, it's just that its levels in the blood plasma control hormone release. And then finally we have hormonal control of hormone release. In other words, one hormone causes the release of another hormone. Here you can see the first endocrine organ. For some reason it's stimulated to release a hormone that causes the release of a second hormone from another endocrine gland. So one hormone causes the release of another. This is why we call this hormonal control. As the levels of this end hormone rise, it will usually shut down secretion of the hormone from the first endocrine gland in the chain. So once again, three levels of control of hormone secretion: neural, humoral, and hormonal. Now let's take a look at something we mentioned a couple of times in the previous slide, that is the negative feedback control for hormone release. This is the major mechanism that controls hormone regulation. This diagram should look familiar to you. We saw this when we discussed homeostasis early in the course. If, for example, levels of a hormone become too high, what will happen is receptors will detect that heightened level of hormone in the body, and a control center will inhibit secretion of a hormone by an endocrine gland, and basically that will decrease levels of the hormone, and so levels of hormone then return toward normal. And the opposite case is true when hormone levels are too low in the body. When the hormone levels drop, receptors pick that up as well. The control center stimulates an endocrine gland to release the hormone, levels of the hormone rise, and that will bring hormone levels back toward normal. Just to remind you once again that when we talk about levels of something in homeostatic terms, we say that we have a set point indicated here by this steady line. However, levels of substances in each system in the body that are regulated by homeostasis actually fluctuate, as you see here. So there's always an oscillation about a set point. We never maintain constant levels of anything, but more stable levels of things. In this lecture, our focus is going to be on the master control axis we have, which is the hypothalamic pituitary gland axis, which is located here in the brain. We want to talk most about this here because this is a major control center for release of many hormones throughout the body. And we're going to hold off on the parathyroid and thyroid gland until part 3 of our lecture. So let's talk a little bit about the hypothalamus and about the pituitary gland. First of all, let's target the pituitary gland. This is also called the hypophysis. So this is another name for the pituitary gland. And there are two distinct portions of the pituitary gland, an anterior portion and a posterior portion. If you look in the diagram down here, you'll see the pituitary that I'm circling right here. The front portion here is the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and then we have the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland back here. In fact, these are functionally as well as anatomically distinct. They actually come from different places during development. The anterior lobe comes up from the roof of the mouth. The posterior lobe comes down from the brain. So this one arises from the nervous system. So this is the posterior pituitary. For that reason, we call this the neurohypophysis. The anterior pituitary, however, is more of a glandular organ. And for that reason, we call this an adenohypophysis. Adeno means glandular. So these arise from different places during embryonic development, and hence they are functionally as well as anatomically distinct, and we'll talk about each of the parts in turn. You'll also notice that we have a portion of the brain here, the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is really the major connection of the brain with the pituitary gland. We're going to talk about this connection, which is very, very important, in a couple of minutes. You'll notice a couple of other things we saw in A&P1. Number one, this bone right here is the sphenoid bone, and that little pocket that the pituitary sits in, remember, is called the sella turcica. This protects the pituitary, and this is lined, of course, by the three meninges that we talked about. So we see the outer layer here of the dura mater. Okay, so this terminology here is important for you to remember, the different names of the pituitary. Let's talk a little bit more about the pituitary and talk about what it actually secretes. Now here you'll see in this diagram, we once again divide the pituitary into the anterior and posterior. So let's talk about each of these in turn. Let's first talk about the hormones of the anterior pituitary gland. These hormones, as you see, include a hormone called ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone. If you look in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, you'll see not only the abbreviations for these hormones, but also the name of the hormone following this. These names will make more sense as we go through the different endocrine organs and we talk a little bit more about them. I do want you to know all of the information that you see in the table up here, which is why I have it boxed in red. You should know the abbreviations. You should also know the names for each of these hormones. So once again, from the anterior pituitary, we have a hormone called ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which influences hormone secretion from the adrenal gland. A hormone called TSH, which is, as you see, thyroid stimulating hormone. This influences thyroid gland hormone secretion. We have another one called growth hormone, and growth hormone, as you might think, causes growth of tissues in the body. We'll talk about that in a little while. We have another one called prolactin, and lacto means milk. What prolactin actually does is promote milk production in the breasts of pregnant and lactating women. And then finally, we have two hormones that are related to sex hormones. This is follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And so we're going to call these two sex hormones, and I'll tell you why we're going to designate them as such in a couple of minutes. It'll make more sense. Follicle stimulating hormone as well as luteinizing hormone have an effect on what we call the gonads, or the primary sex organs of males and females. In females, of course, these would be the ovaries. In males, these would be the testes. And these cause variable effects. As you notice, follicle stimulating hormone in males will cause the production of sperm. Follicle stimulating hormone in females will cause the production of eggs. Luteinizing hormone in both males and females causes an increase in the production of sex hormones. In males, this would be testosterone. In females, this would be estrogen. Now, as far as MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone, the significance of this is uncertain. We're not really going to cover this here. So we're only going to consider these first set of hormones that we looked at right up here. Now, I know that's a lot of hormones for you to remember, but there's a mnemonic that you can use to remember these, and that is SET-GAP. Let me tell you how we get this. The SE right here actually stands for sex. Easy to remember, that comes first, right? So sex stands for both FSH and LH. These are the sex hormones that are secreted by the anterior pituitary. The T in SET-GAP stands for TSH. The G stands for growth hormone. The A for ACTH, and the P for prolactin. So this is a nifty little mnemonic that you can use to remember all the hormones that we're concerned with that are going to be secreted by the anterior pituitary, and that is SET-GAP. I'm going to review this a couple of times as we go through the different anterior pituitary hormones. Now, there are only two hormones secreted by the posterior pituitary gland. Those are oxytocin and ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone influences the kidneys to reclaim water into the body so that we don't get dehydrated. Oxytocin is a smooth muscle contractor. So in a woman, for example, who is pregnant and has almost reached term of pregnancy, oxytocin will begin to cause uterine smooth muscle contraction and will eventually push the baby out. Also, for a mother who is nursing, oxytocin will cause smooth muscle around the mammary glands to contract and actually forcibly eject milk from the breasts. Remember, we said before that prolactin was responsible for milk production. Oxytocin is responsible for its ejection. Okay, so only two hormones from the posterior pituitary, oxytocin and ADH. Now let's take a closer look at how these two, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, are related. In the hypothalamus we have neurons, and these neurons send processes or axons down to both the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. But they work a little bit differently. Let's take a look at the ones that secrete what we call releasing hormones. These influence release of hormones by the anterior pituitary. So let's follow this along. We have neurons up here in the hypothalamus, and what these do is, in the cell bodies of these neurons, that is in the soma of these particular neurons, what they manufacture are what we call releasing factors or releasing hormones. After these neurons synthesize releasing factors, these are transported down to the terminal ends here, the synaptic knobs, and you notice right at the end of these neurons we have blood vessels. We have a small capillary network down here. So these neurons secrete releasing factors into this capillary network. It's picked up into the veins and traveled to a second capillary plexus down here. And if you remember, whenever we had two capillaries in series, we referred to that as a portal system, as we looked at a couple of times with the hepatic portal system. So for that reason, this particular blood connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary is known as the hypophyseal portal system. Remember, the pituitary is called the hypophysis. Keep in mind that this only has to do with the anterior pituitary, not the posterior. So the hypophyseal portal system is the connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And the way the hormones get released from the anterior pituitary is that all of those set gap hormones that we looked at before have to be released by releasing factors that come down from the hypothalamus. Now let's take a look at how the posterior pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus. These neurons here synthesize both ADH as well as oxytocin. So these cell bodies synthesize these hormones directly, and when these neurons fire, they release these hormones right into the blood, directly into a capillary bed that takes these hormones away from the posterior pituitary. So for this reason, we call the posterior pituitary the neurohypophysis. So this is a neural mechanism of release, whereas the anterior pituitary is a glandular mechanism of release, so we call the anterior pituitary the adenohypophysis. Okay, so let's take a look in a kind of schematic way at the releasing factors that come from the hypothalamus, which we see here, and the anterior pituitary hormones, which are released after they're stimulated by releasing factors. Remember, we're looking now at the anterior pituitary, and the hormones that are secreted by the anterior pituitary are the set gap hormones. That is the sex hormones, TSH, growth hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and prolactin. And you'll see this blood vessel down here on the bottom containing all of these hormones. This is representing the anterior pituitary. In the lower portion, up here, we're representing the hypothalamus and the neurons that release the releasing factors. Notice the names of these releasing factors. They're either called releasing hormones or releasing factors. For example, thyrotropin releasing hormone is something that causes the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, which eventually causes the release of thyroid hormones, which we're going to look at later, T3 and T4, from the thyroid gland. Prolactin releasing factor, which is now known to be dopamine, actually causes the prolactin to be released from the anterior pituitary. This stimulates the mammary glands directly to upregulate their production of milk. Corticotropin releasing hormone causes the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary. This in turn stimulates the adrenal to release hormones. We also have, remember, the sex hormones down here, and they included LH and FSH, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. The release of these hormones is controlled by a very important releasing hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone. We're going to talk much more about the relationship of gonadotropin releasing hormone, LH and FSH, when we have the reproductive lectures at the end of the course. What these do, as I mentioned before, follicle stimulating hormone causes an upregulation in the production of gametes, that is sperm in males, eggs in females. Luteinizing hormone causes an increase in the release of sex hormones from the ovaries and from the testes. And finally, we have growth hormone releasing hormone, which stimulates the release of growth hormone, which, as you can see, has a direct effect on several tissues to upregulate their growth. And we're going to talk about that in a little while. One point you have to be clear on is the fact that any time a hormone is getting released from the anterior pituitary, its release must have been stimulated by a releasing hormone or releasing factor from the hypothalamus. And the connection between these two, between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, if you remember from the previous slide, was the hypophyseal portal system. Now, a couple of other terms I want to introduce here. You'll notice that in TSH, ACTH, and LH and FSH, when these are secreted from the anterior pituitary and they reach their target tissues, for example TSH in the thyroid, this causes release of additional hormones. Luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, especially in the case of luteinizing hormone, this will cause an increase in sex hormone secretion. ACTH, when it's released, will cause a release of another hormone from the adrenal cortex. So what I want you to realize is that these hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary that cause the release of another hormone are known as tropic hormones. So the tropic hormones that are shown in these black boxes control the activity of other endocrine glands. You'll notice two of the hormones that are secreted by the anterior pituitary are not tropic hormones. For example, prolactin. This doesn't cause the release of any hormones from the target tissue, which is the mammary glands. Instead, this causes an upregulation in milk production, so no secretion of hormones. The other one is growth hormone. Growth hormone doesn't cause an increase in the production of any kind of hormones from its target tissues. Rather, it influences them to grow directly. So only tropic hormones control the activity of other endocrine glands. And the anterior pituitary hormones that are tropic would include TSH, ACTH, LH, and FSH. Now, the last thing I want to mention on this slide is the term axis. And you'll see that on the bottom of this red box I just put up. An axis is a relationship between the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the target endocrine organ for tropic hormones. So, for example, we would have a hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. We would have another axis here, and we would call this the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And we would have one more axis here, which we would call the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. So whenever we have tropic hormones involved being secreted from the anterior pituitary, this involves an axis that includes a portion of the hypothalamus, the pituitary, as well as the target endocrine organ. Now let's begin our discussion of individual hormones. On these slides, the things that I think are most important for you to remember I've indicated in red. Some of these other things might be nice for you to look at. You can get a little bit more information in your textbook about these. But the things really to remember, and I know this is a lot of information for you to remember on the endocrine system, I kind of flagged in red so that you'd have a good summary of those things that you need to know. Let's talk first about growth hormone. As I said, the name growth hormone implies that what's going to happen is skeletal muscle, bone, cartilage are going to grow. And that's in fact exactly the effect of growth hormone. It stimulates an increase in size. It also stimulates an increase in rate of metabolism in these body cells. This is something that we call an anabolic or tissue building type hormone. That means that when it stimulates its target tissues, these tissues grow, they build. So this is why we call it anabolic. Remember from AMP1, anabolism means adding to something. The other thing about growth hormone is we also call this a diabetogenic hormone because this actually raises levels of glucose. Makes sense if you think about it, because if we want tissues to grow, they're going to need more energy to do that, and so they have to increase the concentration of glucose in the body so that the glucose is available for those tissues. The other term I want to introduce here is something called a circadian rhythm or a circadian pattern. This is a 24-hour pattern of secretion. Growth hormone, for example, is secreted highest during sleep. This is one of the reasons why children need so much sleep. Growth hormone is secreted, and this is really when their growth spurts occur. And finally, down the bottom of the slide, I'll mention that the releasing factor for growth hormone is growth hormone releasing hormone. Where is this secreted from? Sure, if you said the hypothalamus, you're exactly correct. Remember, we're talking about anterior pituitary hormones, and every hormone that's released from the anterior pituitary needs a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. The next anterior pituitary hormone we want to look at is prolactin. We abbreviate this PRL. As we mentioned, this stimulates milk production by the breast. This rises at the end of pregnancy. It also rises after an infant suckles at the breast after birth. So this really is primarily of concern in a pregnant woman and in a nursing woman. This really isn't seen to have too much of an effect on males, other than perhaps stimulating an increase in the sensitivity of what we call interstitial cells in the testes. And of some note, there's a brief rise in prolactin levels just before menstrual periods that can actually cause some breast swelling and tenderness. So this may be the reason why women have swelling and tenderness in their breasts just prior to getting their menstrual period. Two more hormones of the anterior pituitary we want to talk about: thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. This controls hormones secretion from the thyroid gland, and the release in turn of TSH is controlled by thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. This is TRH. The next one is adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. And the reason we call it adrenocorticotropic, as we'll talk about later, adreno refers to the adrenal gland, cortico refers to the adrenal cortex, and tropic because this is a tropic hormone. That is a hormone that controls hormone release from another endocrine gland. And what this does is actually cause secretion of hormones by the adrenal cortex. Its release is controlled by a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus called corticotropin releasing hormone. So what term would describe these two hormones that cause release of other hormones? Sure, we just said it. That is tropic hormones. So both thyroid stimulating hormone and adrenocorticotropic hormone are tropic hormones. A couple of more tropic hormones that we have are the sex hormones. This is the SE part of set gap. Follicle stimulating hormone, as we said before, stimulates gamete production in both males and females. Its release controlled very importantly by gonadotropin releasing hormone. And then we also have luteinizing hormone, which promotes the secretion of sex hormones in both sexes, and this is also controlled by gonadotropin releasing hormone. Very important relationship between this and these two hormones, and we're going to look at this much more carefully when we talk about the reproductive system. Now lastly, we want to talk about the posterior pituitary hormones. Remember, there are only two of these, ADH and OT. ADH is called antidiuretic hormone. A diuretic, as you probably know, is something that causes water loss from the body. Causes people to increase the urination, causes more water to be lost from the body. An antidiuretic is something that prevents water loss from the body. So antidiuretic hormone function is to cause the kidneys to reduce water excretion so that we retain more water in the body. This is also sometimes called vasopressin or sometimes arginine vasopressin. The reason they call it that is because in high concentrations, which isn't typical, this raises blood pressure. A pressor is something that raises blood pressure, so hence this was given the name vasopressin. Now remember that posterior pituitary hormones, unlike the anterior pituitary hormones, are released directly into the blood. There are no releasing factors involved here. The neurons that are in the hypothalamus directly secrete these hormones into the blood. The second hormone secreted by the posterior pituitary is called oxytocin. We abbreviate this OT. And as I mentioned before, this causes smooth muscle contraction. We have lots of smooth muscle in the uterus. We also have smooth muscle around the mammary glands in the breast. And as we said before, at term, oxytocin levels will start to rise and cause uterine smooth muscle contractions and eventually cause the fetus to be expelled. When the infant suckles at the breast, this causes a rise in oxytocin, which stimulates smooth muscle around the mammary glands and causes milk ejection. This is controlled by the hypothalamus in response to stretch in the uterus and the vaginal walls, and also stimulation of the breasts by suckling of the infant. This is, oddly enough, thought to play a role in sexual arousal, orgasm, sexual satisfaction, promotion of cuddling behavior, in kind of bonding between mates. So this is kind of a feel-good reward type hormone as well. So it does have some brain effects as well as the effects on smooth muscle. Okay, so that finishes off part 2 of lecture 13. In the next lecture, we'll first summarize what we did today, and then we'll also talk a little bit more about some individual hormones in the body. I'll see you then.